John Noe unveils Greater Than We Believe with your host, Stephen King.
Well, welcome back. This is Stephen King and my friend John Noe. We are here putting on a continuing Bible instruction series called Greater Than We Believe. We want to welcome you here and thank you for coming back to see us. We have been discussing the subject of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. We have been working on it from a standpoint of from the spiritual, from the scriptural standpoint for about 50-something, 54, I think, videos. Mm-hmm. We are also talking about the kingdom under another subheading now, more from a practical nuts and bolts, get your hands dirty, pastoral, everyday living standpoint. And so this series is called Kingdom Driven Church, the Kingdom Driven Church. And today's video, number 108, is Promotion and Expansion. So, John, you just continue to what you started with us and take us on a ride here. And I'm eager to see what you got to say about promoting and expanding the kingdom in a practical way.
Well, let me address something I said in I think it was the last video,
okay,
or maybe the one before that. I'm sitting here thinking, why did I say that? And I ask our viewers, why do you go to church?
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, that was.
Well, let me turn that. Why do I go to church?
Yes.
Because I go to church.
Yes.
And, you might ask yourself, and I've been asked this, well, with all these deficiencies, why do you continue to go to church? And the reason I do is because I consider the church a mission field.
Yes.
Not a sub-mission field.
Right.
Big difference.
Yes. And by submission, you mean submission.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Pastor Sunday, in his book, The Kingdom Driven Life, that we're using here to take portions of it and
sure,
interact with and so forth. In his chapter 7 on promotion and expansion of the kingdom, makes a bold statement. Actually, it's a reiteration
right,
of things he's done before. He starts it off like this. The mandate of the church is to promote kingdom expansion on earth. That's what he says. Do you hear anything about salvation in that?
Nope.
Well, it's part of it.
Yep.
But it's not. It's the kingdom.
That's the point.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Salvation is the ticket in.
Yes.
It won't keep you in.
No.
Obedience keeps you in.
Right.
But you can re-enter.
Yes.
Okay. So he goes on, he says, so it is vital that as believers we grasp the proper relationship of the church to Christ and to the kingdom. Remember, he said the kingdom is absolute and the church is relative.
Yes.
We talked about that before. He says, otherwise, the church becomes a mere caricature. What's a caricature? What does that mean? I should have looked that up.
Well, I think
a mere caricature.
A caricature is when you have an artist that draws pictures of people on the sidewalk and he exaggerates their features. Like if a guy's got a prominent jaw like Jay Leno, he got that big jaw in the caricature, and it's a comic relief version of the real thing.
Well, that's what he says.
Yeah.
He says, otherwise, the church becomes a mere caricature of what Christ intended.
Right.
And suffers irrelevance to the kingdom of God, to believers, and to the divine purpose for which it was conceived, which is to expand the kingdom.
Yes.
Interesting perspective, don't you think? So he talks about a larger vision. We talk about greater than we believe.
Yes.
Same thing. Probably. We'll see. We'll see here. He says, there came a time when I is Pastor Sunday,
Yes.
when I discovered that my goal of being a great pastor was not enough. Quite an admission, huh? Quite a catharticism. He said, pastoring the great church of God had established was not the full extent of his calling for my life. He said, I determined to seek him and until he would speak to me about my personal mandate. When he did, I discovered my much larger vision than I had ever dreamed possible. Wow. Well, I mean, he had a huge church, 15,000 after about 12 years, and then
8 or 12,
and then more,
yeah.
and then continued to grow even further. He said, what I learned at the end of that adventure was that God was not expecting me to pastor a local church. And by the way, that was a local mega church.
Yeah.
Mega. But to accept his calling to be a deliverer of a nation. Wow. Well, that ought to be interesting. He goes on and he says, I began to understand that in the divine encounter, that the great church he had given me was the instrument that he had ordained to raise up believers and powerful leaders who would take the kingdom outside the walls of the church building and to help bring about redemption of our nation, which was Ukraine. It says, when the kingdom leaves the church, and he says that positively, not when the power of God is leaving, but when the kingdom leaves the church stops living for herself. The eyes of the church are open to the fact that we are not just attending services to have fellowship and worship God corporately. We are here because we are needed by God to be co-laborers with him, to be equipped to receive his assignments and become his hands to restore the peoples of the earth outside our four walls back to himself. In other words, we're called out.
Yes.
Not called in. So I'll fast forward here, and he says that is God's agenda for the church and for the kingdom, is to be sent out, not called in. To leave the church. And yet I still go to church because I see it as a mission field. The people, Pastor Sonny says, who come to the church are supposed to be trained and equipped to be on-site shepherds in the community and in the city or in the nation, and to pastor people that God has sent them to pastor. In other words, a pastor does not have to be confined within four walls of a church building. Pastor, we think mostly, rather, we use the term missionary.
Yes.
But it can be pastor as well. That's what he's saying here. He says, they are Christians who come to church to do God's service. While there is a legitimate service to the house of God, it should not be at the expense of your labor in the harvest field. So he differentiates the church from the harvest field. Make sense?
Yes.
He says the reason you come to church on Sundays is to get trained. Wow. Why do we come to church on Sundays? Well, we usually say something like, to worship God. Well, why do you have to come to church to worship God? I worship God, like we were talking a little while ago, better out at Fort Bend State Park when I do my 3 miles.
Some alone time with the Lord.
Without anything in my ear interfering.
You can hear that still small voice.
And the reason you come to church on Sundays is to get trained for your ministry outside the church. Well, that's a whole different perspective on what church is, isn't it? And to sing him or hers. I'm trying to be multi woke. Where and outside the church is where you are the pastor in your promised land, in your areas he's calling you into. A God carrier, he calls him. He says, and there is where you must find your place of service to reach the lost sheep. in your promised land as their pastor. Make sense? Mm-hmm. He says, you have the mentality that you are, he says, let's see, otherwise, and see if you agree or disagree with this. In the normal church concept nowadays, says and the mentality that, he says, you have the mentality that you are the Christian and they are the unsaved. You know, us, them.
Yeah.
That sense of superiority raises an invisible wall. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Between the church and the world. It makes Christians feel like they are the elite in society. They are the elite society of believers who are not like those others. Them folk. He says, you need to look at unsaved people as your lost brothers and sisters. Potential believers. Potential future pastors. And potential future God carriers. Rather than, you know, those poor lost suckers
Right.
don't know Jesus. So then, he asks, given that perspective, what is evangelism? Redefined.
Sure.
Or restructured. He says, in my church, we don't do typical church-type evangelism. Oh, really? Well, what do they do? Well, see if you agree or disagree with this. He says their goal is to be God carriers, and they understand that their place of employment is a platform for sharing the love of Jesus Christ and extending the principles of the kingdom. And salary is not the only compensation for their labor. He says they are not employees. They are primarily agents of God.
Yes.
His servants, kingdom carriers. They are here to live the lifestyle of the kingdom in their place of employment and other places. That is what it means to seek first the kingdom, he says, to seek to advance it throughout the earth. And what, he says, that is the meaning of life as a believer. Your ministry is outside the church walls. So, how can we do that in the United States?
I'd love to know.
Huh?
I'd love to know.
How can we do that without getting in trouble legally?
I don't care. Tell me.
He goes on, keep in mind he's from Ukraine. He says, because they leave the church, the kingdom of God, or because they leave the church, the kingdom of God leaves the church. These believers are motivated with the priority of spreading the kingdom to every sphere of life where they find themselves. Thankfully, our problem is not that no one has been saved in our church for a year. He says, our problem is what to do with the harvest that is so plentiful that our nets are breaking. What a wonderful problem. It is a result of teaching believers to take the kingdom outside the church and to have the right mindset about their calling and about their priority. And while inside the church, they are being trained and equipped to take the kingdom outside the church, rather than sermons about how to get their needs met or how to feel better about things.
Yeah.
All this other kind of stuff. He says, with this perspective, the church makes sense. Church members do not attend church for 10 years and become bored or contentious and cause problems.
Right.
And church splits and so forth, and trying to make the church look or having the motivation to try to find a better church that more meets my
Needs. Yeah.
There's that selfish stuff again that he was talking about earlier. He says people do not make the spreading of the kingdom, or he says people who do not make the spreading of the kingdom their priority just come to church week after week doing the same old thing over and over.
Expecting different results.
Which is suffocating, he says. Now you might not agree with this. Robbing them of life, he says. That is why people run from one church to
Another.
He says, I tell my church that my assignment, here it is again, I love this. My assignment as their pastor is to get rid of you.
Thanks, I think.
To get you out of the pews. This is my assignment. No one has a calling to sit in a pew. Oh, my calling is to sit in a pew. Of a church. The only calling we have is to two letters. Go. G-O. And that calling is for everyone. So when the kingdom leaves the church, having been properly equipped, which is the role of the church he's talking about, is an equipping center, there is potential for mass salvations in your community, city, or nation. And that's what they've been experiencing over in Ukraine. So he says, we refer to our church as a church without walls. Every member of the church is in training to become a fruitful laborer in the harvest. And that is revival. And that is spreading throughout our city, our nation, and to other nations of the world. So he next moves to spotlight 7 spheres of influence, and I'm not going to get into all these, but they are to be. He says there is to be a specific strategy developed for being effective in reaping the harvest in each one of these, and these are the 7 that he mentions here, and there's more. The main categories are business, economics, arts, culture, sports, social, spiritual pursuits, education, entertainment, media, and the political area. So obviously he doesn't understand mathematics, right? That's more than 7, isn't it? All right, that's more than 7. I think that's more than 7.
Yeah.
So let me just highlight a couple things. In what he calls the spiritual social sphere, I kind of like this. He says, when church leaders emphasize only classical ministry positions in a church as a potential territory for serving God, people who are not called to pastor a church become frustrated. They may try to compete with the pastor and create a split in the church itself, instead of finding their promised land outside the church.
Yes.
For their fulfillment and usefulness of social and spiritual service, where they can be called to be effective and fruitful and fulfilled, and the pastor of that area. He said, when I began to teach this principle of finding your personal destiny, people began to realize that they are not called to be pastors or pulpit ministers. They understood that every minister could actually be fulfilled without the necessity of fighting for the pulpit. You know what that means, fighting for the pulpit? What do you think that means?
You don't have to go to seminary and all this other stuff to become good enough to stand up in the pulpit and...
Yeah, or why don't they let me preach?
Yeah.
Or why can't I teach here?
Right.
Or something like that. Which could result in splitting the church.
Right. Which it does.
Which it does.
Yes.
They are free to fulfill their destiny because the pastor encourages them to go and fulfill their destiny.
Yes.
And their calling. The next question that people ask is, what happens to those who are called as pastors that come into your auspices, who are actually called to do pulpit ministry? He says, well, as soon as I or they recognize that they have this calling, they go through a training process in the church to prepare them to become pastors of a church. And then they are encouraged to get out of here.
Yeah.
They're encouraged to step out of our church and launch their own ministries. That's why they've spawned, what was it, 600 ministries or
600 churches they planted, yeah.
Worldwide?
Right.
He says, as a result, we have established 35 churches just in the city of Kiev, all of which have different registered names. We have churches here that have expanded,
yes,
keep the same names.
Yes.
Why?
Like a corporation.
Why is that? Separate, they have different registered names, identities, offices, and bookkeeping entities. This standard of helping pastors get established largely explains why church splits are not a problem for our church.
It's supposed to.
Yeah. He says, that is my agenda as an equipping pastor to get rid of my parishioners. Get rid of them. Get them in, get them trained, and get rid of them. And then the people that they pastor, well, let's send them, we'll train them, and then we'll send them out. In that way, we have been able to establish over 700 churches in the last 10 years.
Wow.
That's something. And then he's got a section on helping the poor, one on the political agenda. Here's just one tidbit out of that one. He said, I explain that one way to recognize your calling is to consider what is annoying you. What really honks you off?
Yeah.
He says, whatever ill of society you see that irritates you indicates that you have a burden for that area of need. It matters to you. And it may seem that others are not doing it right or are not doing enough. And you have ideas how to make it work and how to make it better. I tell my people not to whine and complain about what you see, but do something about it. And if this is your burden, then that's your burden for extending the kingdom into that sphere of life. He talks about the educational sphere, which is a huge mess in all over the world, even here in America. Business and economics. The sports arena he even talks about. Arts and culture, that would include Hollywood and media and other things. Oh, here's media and entertainment, and there's more, and which I'm not. Get the book. Get the book. So he concludes with this, Stephen. He designed the church to specifically facilitate the increase of the kingdom. And the church is established to equip believers to discern the kingdom of God and extend his domain throughout the earth. Lastly, in his kingdom principles from this chapter, he said, once again, I like this so much. My assignment as a pastor is to get rid of you. My parishioners, to get them out of the pews. No one has a calling to sit in the pew of a church. My calling is to sit in the pew. The only calling we have is to go.
Yes.
So let's go. Let's go.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's go.
I'll go fill up the car and we'll take off.
Yeah, let's go.
Thank you, John. Well, that was video number 108, Promotion and Expansion. I hope you're enjoying this series. If you don't already have your own copy of these two books, I would suggest you get it because there's a lot he's passing by. He's doing like a Cliff's Notes version here, and even then, it's not hitting everything. But there's enough to whet your appetite to make it worth your time to sit and read. Our next week's video, number 109, will be called The Pursuit. And when you pursue something, it's I guess it depends on what it is you're pursuing, but usually you pursue something that you want. Our Declaration of Independence said we had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No one guaranteed us happiness; they just guaranteed us we have a guaranteed right to pursue it. And so, when it comes to our relationship with God and our worship of Him and our pursuit of the kingdom and pursuit of promoting that kingdom, that's something that we need to be equipped for. It's there's more to it than just chasing after the rainbows. So, John, I look forward to this next week. I hope that you're all benefiting from what we're doing here. Please feel free to add your notes and comments on the bottom of the YouTube page there, or to get in touch with John through the website, theprophecyrefi.org. You can do the email address there. We need to get some input from the viewers and get an idea of how we are doing in our ministering to you. And if you're getting something good out of this, if it's benefiting you, we'd like to know that. We'd like to know how and why. And we just appreciate your prayers. Thank you so much. God bless you all. We'll see you next week. All right.